Earlier this year, we came close to losing one of the foundational pillars of vulnerability management, the CVE Program. A lapse in funding to MITRE, which operates the program on behalf of the US government, nearly brought the entire system to a halt, threatening vendor disclosures, scanner integrations, and vulnerability tracking across the industry. In the aftermath, I interviewed Pete Aller from the CVE Foundation, who emphasized their vision of a more open and sustainable future for the program. After that interview was published, I was sent an article from the Open Source Security Foundation titled Vulnerability Enumeration Conundrum, an open source perspective on CVE and CWE. It makes a case for a more community-driven, open alternative, one where organizations like OWASP and OpenSSF take on a larger role in how vulnerabilities are defined and tracked. To talk about that vision, I'm joined by Steve Springett, a longtime leader in secure software development and open source advocacy. Steve serves as vice chair of the OWASP Foundation board and leads various OWASP projects, including Dependency Track. We're going to explore whether OWASP and OpenSSF are ready to take on such a critical role and what it would take to build a credible alternative to CVE and CWE. But before we get into that conversation, a quick word about this video's sponsor, ThreatLocker. Setting up endpoint protection for your business shouldn't feel like a second job, and with ThreatLocker, it doesn't. Once you deploy the lightweight agent across your endpoints, it enters learning mode, monitoring normal activity, creating a baseline, all so you don't have to build policies from scratch. ThreatLocker categorizes all software in your environment using over 7,000 built-in application definitions, which are regularly updated to ensure a seamless end-user experience. If you run custom applications, no problem. ThreatLocker will track those too and add them to the allow list. Once complete, switch to secured mode, and ThreatLocker will enforce a deny by default policy based on what it learned about your environment. No bloat, no rebooting, and zero trust security that actually works. Go to threatlocker.com/Tiberius and take control of your security today. Well, Steve, thanks so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Tiberius.
Let's start with the basics. What is the core vision behind an open source alternative to the CVE and CWE programs? In what ways would it mirror the current model, and where would it differ?
So one of the things we're trying to do is really step back a little bit and figure out what worked with the current program and where some of the challenges are. The OWASP Foundation, OpenSSF, a bunch of other organizations have partnered and are working collaboratively on a solution. We don't necessarily know what that solution today is going to be because, again, we're taking a step back and figuring out what works, what doesn't. And as part of that, one of the things that I'm proposing is essentially a threat model for the program itself. We're obviously all talking about this from a funding perspective. Funds were removed from the CVE program, and those source of funds were from a central government. Simply replacing those funds isn't necessarily fixing the problem. It's prolonging the inevitability of that same problem occurring again. So how do we essentially diversify our funding sources? And when I say diversify, I'm not necessarily talking about funding from more than one government. I'm talking about funding from things other than governments. And when you fund from things other than governments, you have to provide a lot more value than just vulnerability information. No vendor really wants to fund something that's going to tell the public everything that's wrong with their products. You have to have a lot of other value adds in there. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for things that were missing in the existing program. And even with the continuation of that program, whether it's the CVE program, CVE Foundation, whatever, the same challenges are still going to be there. So I think it's an opportunity to kind of step back, figure out what exactly do we want. There seems to be a really big appetite for things other than vulnerability information that would be incredibly useful to the general public.
Was this something that was already in the works, or did the recent MITRE funding situation sort of serve as a spark that accelerated the initiative?
No, it served as a spark for sure. We were considering a lot of other complementary types of data sources, but the MITRE funding issue certainly lit a match under a lot of folks. I'm vice chair of the foundation's board, and we had an emergency meeting after a certain letter was leaked. Thank you for that. But we had an emergency board meeting, and all of the directors were essentially unanimous in the fact that this is something that is in OWASP's mission to do. Now, are we the sole stewards of this thing? Absolutely not. But it is in our kind of mission of no more insecure software to champion things such as transparency that really move the needle forward. So we're trying to work with as many open source foundations as humanly possible. We're going to be extending those to government, to industry, to all kinds of stakeholders who currently are not necessarily involved in the current programs.
So why do you believe that OWASP, OpenSSF, and even the broader open source community are better positioned to take on this role than organizations like MITRE?
I don't necessarily know if it's going to be open source, right? We certainly want free information. We want that information to be interoperable, right? So open is kind of the key word here. But open source foundations, whether it's the OpenSSF or the OWASP Foundation. OWASP Foundation is interesting because we're not specifically open source. All of our projects are open source. It's a hard requirement, but we don't exclude commercial entities, right? We work a lot with commercial entities, and I think that's important. But as open source communities, we're accustomed to actually extending arms to other communities. For example, some of the work that I'm working on, we're working with the Python folks, we're working with Erlang folks, we're working with the some of the folks in the Linux Foundation. We're constantly working with very diverse stakeholders, and I think this is kind of the key point. It's the right thing to do, right? We're not necessarily doing it because we're getting paid to do it. We're doing it because we want to get everybody's buy-in so that we can, in fact, move the needle forward.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. So the CVE Foundation includes many current or former CVE board members, and it claims to be moving towards greater openness. Doesn't that make them the logical successor?
That's fine. I have nothing against the CVE program. If the foundation wants to move that forward, let them do that. Some view that fraction in not the greatest light. I don't really have a stake in the game, so I really don't have an opinion on that. But I will say that the CVE program, whether it's managed by MITRE or managed by the CVE Foundation, there's some fundamental things that are just inherently flawed with how all of this works today. And when I opened with the fact that we really want to threat model how it works and threat model some of the proposals that we have, I sincerely mean that. CVE and that entire thing was really designed in a time where basic forms of automation were acceptable. You had a few dozen commercial vendors, you had a few dozen vulnerabilities, and simple forms of automation were fine. That hasn't existed in a long time. We live in a world where hyperautomation is a requirement. Without the proper automation in place, you're going to continue to have things like backlogs of vulnerabilities not being rated and CPEs not being assigned. And CPE itself is inherently flawed. So we're looking at that as well. For example, the NVD, whether or not you get the information from the CVE upstream or the NVD, has not been useful to application security ever, right? It cannot be automated. You have to read the descriptions a lot of times to figure out whether or not, from an application security perspective, whether or not you are affected or not. From a basic vulnerability management perspective as well, it is impossible to perform good vulnerability management against a piece of software that may never have had a vulnerability previously. these are flaws in how the existing program works. So if the CVE Foundation wants to fix the funding issue, that's great. But everything else that around it is inherently flawed. So we're trying to do the threat model, figure out what works, what doesn't. We obviously do not want to repeat the same mistakes that the CVE program has made, but we certainly want to learn from them to figure out what in fact did work. So yeah, we're trying to assemble some really bright minds. We've got some folks from the CVE folks from the program, as well as all kinds of other perspectives coming to the table and really figuring out what problems is it that we want to solve. Because again, a lot of what we hear is that vulnerabilities are nice and that's kind of the minimal viable product. But in reality, organizations want a lot more than just vulnerability information.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's good. I like that. So I want to be blunt, and we've briefly sort of mentioned funding issues at the start, but OWASP itself has previously faced criticism around how it funds and manages large-scale projects, which this would be, notably culminating in a letter co-signed by about 80 contributors and eventually leading to ZAP's departure from OWASP. What's been done to address those concerns, and how can the community be confident that this new effort is going to be better funded and managed?
That's a fair question. I actually personally signed that thing you're referring to as well. So yeah, there are some not so public things that the foundation is in fact working on to diversify the amount of funding and the channels of funding that the foundation receives. In some cases, anybody can start an OWASP project. And successful projects, sometimes their leaders find themselves that they really like doing it and they want to be a full-time open source developer. The OWASP Foundation currently is not set up for that, right? It is not set up to fund open source development as a profession, right? That's not what it was designed for. So unfortunately, that applied to two of the leaders of ZAP, and that was kind of unfortunate, but that was essentially the reality. I think this initiative is going to be successful because while OWASP is certainly the one to bring everybody to the table, we're not the ones that's going to be in charge of this thing. In fact, we're trying to step back again and figure out what kind of organization needs to be put in place. Can we use an existing organization? Does a new entity have to be created? Because we want the solution to be federated, and not just the technology, but the business itself, the organization itself. And the OWASP Foundation is not set up for that, but what organization would be? So these are some of the challenges. These are some of the questions that we're trying to solve for.
Nice. Yeah, that's a good answer, I think. Under the current CVE program, organizations can become CVE numbering authorities, CNAs. That gives them the ability to assign CVEs directly. Would this new alternative adopt a similar structure? And if so, how would you ensure that those entities act in good faith and don't abuse that power?
Yeah, it would be, again, the focus is really going to be on hyperautomation. If you look at the C in CVE, right, there's nothing really common about CVEs. They haven't been common for a really long time. In fact, most sources of vulnerability intelligence actually do not have CVE identifiers because of all of the legacy processes, manual processes that you have to go through in order to publish a vulnerability. So we absolutely want a more federated model. We want it decentralized, and we want the ability for folks to essentially, anybody, to essentially comment and assert certain things on the records, right? So for example, if a vendor were to publish a vulnerability in a product, anyone that was registered in the system could theoretically go in and update information, and you'd have, all the different copies of data available to you. The more data that's available to consumers, the more context we're actually going to have when it comes to protecting our own houses. So I don't want to have any kind of solution that blocks anybody from publishing really good and informative information. But obviously the safeguards have got to be in place, which is why threat modeling is kind of essential, because for all of these use cases that we're going to be coming up with, there's going to be a fair amount of abuse cases that we would have to design against.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's going to be some kind of community moderation of some kind to prevent just anyone signing up and being able to effectively troll, I guess, a CVE or whatever we end up calling it.
Yeah, fair enough. Again, we haven't gone so far yet as to work out all the use cases that we initially want to support. Ole Johansson, who's de facto kind of leading this effort now, he's kind of come up with a 3-phase approach, and we're kind of in that initial phase right now where we're essentially just planning, coming up with the use cases. Once we have the use cases, obviously requirements and all those types of things come in, and not technical requirements, just business level type of requirements. The technical stuff, that comes later, which is interesting because, some people want to dive directly into the technical, solve it with technology, but the threats that we've identified in the current system can't, in fact, be solved with technology, right? The technology will come much later.
So we've seen previous attempts to offer alternatives to CVE, like the EU vulnerability database. Most of them still end up referencing CVEs. So if multiple systems do coexist, do we risk ending up in the same situation as threat actor naming, where the same vulnerability has multiple identifiers, leading to confusion with both researchers and vendors?
I don't think so. I think there was a huge opportunity that ENISA had, and unfortunately, I don't think that opportunity was realized. I think initially, once we have everything figured out, I think the CVE program, whether it's still done by MITRE or the CVE Foundation, is kind of irrelevant. That's essentially going to be a major input into this program that we're developing. And I believe over time, through simple matters of efficiency, that reliance on CVEs will decrease year after year after year. The reality is that all of these manual processes that are currently part of that program, while some of them absolutely do need to exist, the majority of them, in fact, do not. So from an efficiency perspective, I think, again, initially, we're going to be relying upon CVEs, but long term, I think you'll likely see them diminish over time, would be my guess.
So it's sort of almost moving towards one singular solution is really your long-term ideal goal.
It's long-term ideal. Aliasing and mapping vulnerabilities between things rarely is successful. One of the things that I'm involved with is OWASP Dependency Track, which is a platform to consume and analyze SBOMs. And we support a lot of different sources of vulnerability intelligence, including OSV, which has the mappings. And I will tell you, while it's gotten better, the mappings are always flawed. There's always data errors in that. And you also have situations where a single vulnerability might actually refer to multiple vulnerabilities. So there's all these other cases that you just can't do with aliasing. So hopefully we won't have to do that. I know ENISA is doing a lot of that. Not a big fan. OSV is doing that a little bit. Not a big fan. I think there's better ways to achieve that.
So the CVE program currently uses CVSS to assign severity scores to vulnerabilities. I know CVSS is a controversial topic, but with this new alternative sort of continue relying on CVSS, or is there an opportunity or a need to create some kind of better standard?
There are many different ways to represent the severity of things and the risk of things. In my personal opinion, we should support them all. So if a vulnerability doesn't have CVSS and maybe uses some other scoring mechanism, we should absolutely support that within some boundaries. CVS version 4, while I know the NVD is moving toward it, I find interesting because it is impossible to implement CVS version 4 as written, because you actually have to rely upon a data file provided by Red Hat, which has a different license to what CVSS is published under. So it's impossible to read CVS version 4 and actually implement it, which is a huge problem in my opinion. If we're talking about open, we need to support standards that are actually written and can be implemented in the open rather than relying on random data files from other companies.
Yeah, that makes sense. Steve, thank you so much for joining me today for this interview. What can members of the security community do right now to help support or contribute to your effort? How can they get involved?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So send an email to cve@owasp.org. Right now, it is a mailing list, Google Groups. We're scheduling a ton of meetings. We've got a few of them already that we've already had. We are trying to get as many folks to the table as possible. If you are interested, if you have something to contribute, please send an email to cve@owasp.org, and you can be part of the next evolution of the global vulnerability intelligence.
Awesome. I will put all those details in the video description. And Steve, thanks again for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It was great meeting you.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment with your thoughts. A big thank you to ThreatLocker for sponsoring this video. To learn more about ThreatLocker, head over to threatlocker.com/Tiberius, or just click the link in the video description. Until next time, happy hacking.